Hello, everyone, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. Before we get started, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investing advice. Do your own due diligence. And today we are joined by the President and Chief Investment Officer of Rosseau Asset Management, Mr. Warren Irwin. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jesse.
Thanks for coming on. We want to discuss uranium specifically today because I hosted a uranium panel with you at the VRIC, and we were just talking before hitting record here how interesting it was because you kind of brought a bit of a more, don't want to say completely bearish, but perhaps you tempered the enthusiasm of the other panelists, and it was actually much appreciated because it gave a nice balance to the presentation. It wasn't just a cheerleading squad for uranium, so that was awesome. So thanks for that.
Well, you did a great job, Jesse. It was tons of fun, and I love being on there with guys like Rick Rule. He's a legend, and it was tons of fun talking about uranium. And we had slightly different views, and it was a way more fun than like a more boring panel I was on, which was like copper. Okay, everybody's going, "Are you bullish on copper?" Yeah, we are bullish on copper. Yeah. Okay, we're bullish on copper. We need copper to electrify the world. Yeah, copper. Okay. Any dissenting views? No, everybody loves copper. Okay. Like, why have a panel, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we dive into uranium, I'd like to start with your origin story, as I do with all new guests on the show. So, how did you first discover investing? How did that lead you to the commodities space and to becoming the president of Rosseau Asset Management? And also, give us some background on your experience in the uranium sector as well.
All right. So, I got bitten by the bug in the mining business back when I was like a 5-year-old kid, right? Like my neighbor worked at Texas Gulf, the big Kidd Creek mine in Timmins, and I got a tour of it. I went there and saw all these machines, big rock trucks and crushers, and there's tons of gold mines in Timmins. It's gold mining capital of Canada, and there's tons of stories about guys getting rich, and about Benny Hollinger and the McIntyre mine and Noah Timmins, and like it was just a fascinating town to spend. I lived there for 4 years as a kid. So it was fascinating. And that's where I got bit by the bug. So then I went on, quietly lived my life, went to university, went to an undergraduate degree in mathematics. And then I started in finance in 1986. So however many years that's, a lot of years I've been around. And then I went back, got an MBA. I also got a CFA, so a Chartered Financial Analyst. And I got back into the mining business. What really got me going was the whole BREX situation. Many of your listeners may have read some of the articles I wrote on. I got this really good 4-pager on BREX, which summarizes it. So if you want to find it online, just type my name in BREX. There's a 4-pager. It's easy read. You'll learn tons of lessons that I learned, and I just put it out there for everybody else to learn from my experiences. So that really got me going again. And the reason I was interested in BREX is that I'd had some, mining experience, mining interest, and I valued a gold mine for a friend of mine a few years earlier. And interestingly, when I graduated from MBA school, when everybody else thought Russia was going to be, the wall was coming down, well, Russia's going to be the new blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, no, it's not. The Russians are still commies, and you can't change that thinking. So I went to Southeast Asia, and in my tour there, I went to Indonesia, and that's where. So I combined, my knowledge of Indonesia along with my knowledge in gold and my passion for gold, and that's got me into BREX. And at the time, too, it was really exciting in the mid-90s. And we're just coming off a huge win with Voisey's Bay nickel. So that also fired up my passion for nickel, and I've been looking for high-quality nickel sulfide projects ever since then. And it's an exciting business. I've loved it. I've been in it for a lot of years. I founded when I was after MBA school. I worked in M&A at Wood Gundy, CIBC Wood Gundy, and then I went on to Scotia for 3 years, and then I went Deutsche Bank Proprietary Trading for 3 years. I was director of proprietary trading there with a partner of mine. We made the bank a ton of money, and then for the last 24 years, 25 years. Up there, 25 years, I've been at Rosseau. So I am the longest running, I run the longest running resource hedge fund, I think, that I'm aware of. There might be some guy who's got 26 years in Toledo. I don't know. But as far as I'm probably the oldest continuously running resource hedge fund in the world, I think. almost 100% on that.
And if you could give us a little bit of background on your experience in the uranium industry, because I know you've got a lot of experience there too.
Yeah, I have some super smart friends in the uranium business, like geniuses, right? Like they're involved in building SMRs. They're involved, they're very. I don't want to drop names or give much more detail than that, but I have some super smart friends who have been in the business a long time. And when I got into it, I was involved in the last cycle, the 06-07 cycle, and I learned a bunch of lessons there. And I made a bunch of money on two names in the sector, really. The biggest one was Extract Uranium, the Husab deposit. We sold that to the Chinese. Also, I was involved in Con Resources, and we got a big legal settlement from the Mongolian government, and I made some money on that one. I lost some money on, and these are, it's going back quite a number of years, but I lost some money on Goviex. It kind of went up and then went down. I lost some money. I didn't get a zero because it's not a zero. It's still in business. Same with Global Atomic. They're still around. And probably lost a little bit of money there. And then there I had a big, one of them I can remember. I had a zero, which was U308. That was a zero. But, I could share many of those stories as we get into uranium a bit more.
Yeah, great. So let's jump into it because as most people know, you're not as enthusiastic about the uranium space as many of your peers. So how about we start off with give us your assessment of uranium as it stands right now and how you see the sector developing moving forward.
Okay. All right. So again, my experience, I was involved in the last cycle and involved in this cycle too. Just for people who aren't familiar with me, I've probably made... I made more money in the uranium sector than anybody I know, but I'm sure there's more people that have made more money than me. I think I'm approaching $100 million, right, in the last cycle. Virtually all of that was made with NexGen in this cycle, right? And so we had the big cycle last time, ran up, collapsed. I could talk a little bit about that. The key takeaway there is, we touched about it a little bit on the panel, and I encourage anybody to watch the VREC panel when that comes out. But the key there is the big winner there was Paladin, and Paladin went from like pennies or fraction of pennies to $8 or $10, and then collapsed, right? So some people hear these stories and legends, and the Rick Rule tells everybody about this legend, right? And he was involved, and I was not. I know of a friend of mine who was. He personally made $30 million and retired as a result of that. Good for him. And but there are stories like that around. So people all want that to happen again. They all want another Paladin. They all want a hundred bagger. They all want to create generational wealth, and so that's why people are so jacked this cycle, because they want to repeat of the last cycle. And the only cautionary part of that is what people do not tell the new investors to the uranium space is by the peak of the last cycle, there's rumored anywhere from 400 to 600 juniors, right, in the uranium space. And almost everyone went to zero. So last uranium cycle, there was more value destroyed than created, okay? So it was like even Paladin went up and back down. And all the others went to zero. There was no value, like net, massive value destruction. So people all want this to happen again. I'm going, why is that? I guess because they all believe they're smarter than everybody else. And they're going to be the ones that sell Paladin at $10 and get out. And everybody else is going to be holding the bag. And all those other juniors that are flavor of the day, that are all hyped up, and your buddy's telling you, you're hearing it from the cab driver in Vancouver, they all went to zero, right? So that's a quick summary of the last cycle. And people are longing for it because they keep hearing this one narrative, which is Paladin, but they don't hear the 400 to 600 other names, which went to zero. Okay, so that's my experience last cycle, okay? I made money last cycle. I'm cool with that, but I just want to kind of bring some realism to what really happened last cycle. So this cycle, okay, how have I been playing this cycle so far? About 6-7 years ago, I got involved in NexGen. When you get involved in a sector, you don't get involved in it when it's all jacked up and super hype like it is today. I got involved in uranium when everybody hated it. It was like not that far after Fukushima, and like we're talking about single years, a number of single years. I think it was like let's say it was 2015, 16. Fukushima was 2011. So, it was a few years after Fukushima, man. Like there was no Twitter accounts online just pounding the heck out of uranium at those times. So, but then, things started to turn and people were saying, yeah, uranium's great. Look at the supply demand. You're hearing the same nonsense stories that you're hearing today about, there's 180 million pounds of demand. There's 130 primary mine supply, and there's like 40, 50 million made up of the secondary supply, and it's about ready to go. It's almost done. And I've heard this, it's almost done for 7 years. And it gets pretty tiring. And, I listened to some guys the other day talking about all sorts of things, with SWU. They're talking about overfeeding, underfeeding the Russians, Kazatomprom, and expansion of this, expansion of that, restart of Cigar, restart of MacArthur River, and blah, 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 everything but the most important thing. Where is this 40 to 50 million pounds coming from every year? And one commentator said one little thing. He said, the pounds coming into the market for the secondary supply, it's diminishing. And I'm going, okay, where's it coming from? And why is it diminishing? And I had a very wise friend of mine back in when I got involved in NexGen. I said, "Man, this uranium is amazing. Look at the supply demand fundamentals and this big secondary supply issue." He goes, "Warren, there's 1 billion pounds out there that's going to hit the market." And I didn't believe him. I know, of course not. 1 billion pounds. How could it be sitting around 1 billion pounds? I said, "Warren, there's 1 billion pounds out there that's going to hit the market." Well, sure enough, the last 7 years, if you assume like 50 million pounds of secondary hit the market, well, 7 times 50 is 350 million. Then you have Sprott with their spot jumping in there buying another 50 million pounds. And then you got Yellowcake, and then you got Yellowcake jumping in there buying a whole bunch more. And you're looking at, you're well over 400 million pounds of secondary supply hit the market. I'm thinking to my friend, I said, this guy I knew he was smart before because he was the guy who got me into extract too. And I go, man, he's just too smart. And so here we are today. Everybody's saying, they're talking about everything, but the elephant in the room is the secondary supply and where it's coming from and how much is left. And I don't know. So, and nobody I ask seems to know. And so people are having a lot of faith on that. And anyway, so that's kind of where we are today. When I take a look at the uranium market, there's demand and there's supply. On the demand side, the issue we have, right, is we have a reactor base about 450 million reactors. The average age of them is 30 years, right? And most reactors, let's say in Japan, anyways, let's not get specifically about any one country, but, usually a reactor runs for 40 to 50 years, right? In the US, there's talks of extending some of them to 80 years, right? So, and there's people saying, well, you could extend their life indefinitely. But the reality is we have an old reactor fleet globally. It's around 30 years old. And lifespan's around, let's say, 50. And in the US, largest consumer of uranium, their fleet is even older because they haven't built any new ones really. So their fleet is around 40 years old. So it's getting pretty old and pretty tired. And the only people building reactors are the Chinese. So people are saying, Warren, there's 50 new reactors coming on stream in the next 5 years. I go, yeah, that's 10 per year. You take 10 divided by the install base of 450, you get a low single-digit number. And then subtract from that the fact that over the next few years, the US is going to shut down 7 reactors, let alone what the rest of the world is going to do. But their reactors every year will be shutting down. And so not only, in order to keep demand flat, we need to build reactors just to keep demand flat. And to get growth, we'll need to build reactors above the decommissioning rate, right? So this is it's a green technology, and I'm pro uranium. I'm pro nuclear. I think uranium has a great future, and but the growth rates won't be like lithium, because you could crank up production of electric cars in a matter of a few years by 30%, right? So that 30% increase in the demand for lithium. But you can't do that with uranium, because you just can't build reactors that fast. And the Chinese have the biggest build out, probably the biggest build out since the US had their big build out in the 70s. And it's difficult to get more than a low single digit growth. So there you have on the demand side, low single digit growth. On the supply side, we have a whole bunch of pounds coming from somewhere. And so the bull case story, they're talking about, of course, let's not forget Japanese restarts, right? So they restarted, I think, 10 out of 27. They have permits to start a bunch more. I said, okay, great. The Japanese will restart a bunch more, and then the US will shut down a bunch more, and then the rest of the world will shut down a bunch more. And, it's not a super bullish story there. It's still the biggest bull story on the demand side is China. They're building 50, let's say, next 5 years, 10 a year, 10 over 450, work the math out. It's not a crazy bull story on the demand side. And then on the supply side, they're firing up, Cameco's firing up Cigar Lake, MacArthur River. The Kazakhs were down 20% on their production. I think they're now down 10, and they're ramping it back up to the pre-production cuts levels. And people say, well, where are we going to get all this supply? I say, well, there's a big daddy in the room coming at us pretty hard, and it's called NexGen. And they're a year and a half, 2 years from permitting, and then they're probably 4 years of mine build, and you're going to have 30 million pounds coming at us, right?
Okay, interesting. I want to pick apart a few of those things, and this is
Sure.
from people I've spoken to. I interviewed Justin Hune around a month ago, and your name did come up because I had seen you in a recent interview. I think it was on the Jay Martin show, and essentially saying what you're saying right now, that people should temper their expectations. And I just want to give you a couple points he made and get your take on that. And firstly, I want to note that Justin said he doesn't know you personally, but he's seen many of your interviews. He thinks you're very smart. He thinks you've been very successful. So I'm not trying to start any beef here in the uranium community, but before we move into this. But the first point he said was that it seems to him that your essential understanding of the uranium market seems to be coming from a few people within the nuclear world telling you that a lot of supply will become available at higher prices. So I just want to clarify, obviously you can't name names, but could you maybe give us some more color on where you're sourcing your information on all this existing secondary supply that could be coming online?
Yeah, and he may have forgotten to say, I've been doing this for 16 years. So, I love getting, I don't know how long he's been in the business, but I love getting these guys who've been looking at uranium, let's say an extreme example, they've been in 6 months into it. Warren, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a bull. We know you're a bull, Warren, but we're super bulls. And I go, come on. How do guys get beat up for being bullish on uranium? I'm bullish on uranium. I think uranium has a great future. Nuclear power is the only way we're going to power this planet, right? So, things are a little wacky when bulls get beaten up because I'm not bullish enough, right? Okay, I'm just saying that. This is reminding me of the hype and the greed that I haven't seen since the cycle in the 90s, right? Where, man, oh man, you can imagine. Oh, can you imagine the 90s when everybody was so jacked up on Bre-X, and there's Warren out there saying, I think it's a fraud. Oh man, I put up with some abuse then, and then I also put up with quite a bit of abuse. I was right then, and the next most abuse I put up with, somebody who may have followed me when I was on Stockhouse, was when I was beating up fission uranium, and people were just destroying me, and I'm going, well, I'm just telling you what's going on. You guys look at their mine plan, and would you guys like to work in that mine with that mine plan and their putting an open pit in the middle of a lake with the cofferdam around it, and then ramping down underground with the only access point at the bottom of an open pit in the middle of a lake, and you've got 5% uranium with the wind blowing, and there's little fishies living in there. There's like, I think Department of Fisheries are going to like that. Like, and just stating some very, very basic things. And, since then, of course, Fission has updated their mine plan. That's not the way they're going to mine it, right? But man, the abuse I took was pretty wild. Yeah. And, but anyway, so here we are today. So
I just wanted to get a bit more background on who you're sourcing the information from concerning the glut of secondary supply that is available to potentially come back online when it's needed.
Oh, well, he's anyways, he's I haven't checked in with him lately on this, whether they're still, hey, what's the inventory level? Or they still got another 300 million pounds yet? But all I know is it just keeps seeming to hit the market every year, and I still don't know where it's coming from, and nobody seems to know where it's coming from. So, and the people I talk to, as you can imagine, I was the largest shareholder in NexGen, which is the largest and richest uranium discovery in the world. That kind of allowed me to have access to some of the smartest people in the uranium sector, and I learned quite a bit over the years. And remember, this is over many, many years, right? For instance, just a little tidbit of information, if anybody wants to know what Kazatoprom's production is going to be like going forward, they're publicly available. I haven't done this myself, but there's publicly available information on acid purchases because they're put out to tender in Kazakhstan, right? So if you know how much acid they're purchasing, well, you correlate that with production, and you'll find it's a pretty strong correlation. So if you find that their acid purchases are cranking up, you'll know that they're cranking up production too, right? So those are some of the things I picked up from my travels. And but where we are today on secondary supply, I don't know, and I don't know anybody who really has a good handle on things here as to where it's coming from, who's selling. Because as you know, people were asking me the other day about Warren, with this war in Ukraine. I can't believe the price of gold's not going higher. And I said, well, some things don't always work out the way you originally expect. And part of the reason for that is, in the case of this individual that wasn't aware that the Ukrainians had sold $18 billion worth of gold into the spot market, right? So things like that happen. So let's say here we are, we're involved in a war with Russia. Is Russia currently selling any stockpiles of uranium, or do they have stockpiles that they would sell to raise cash to fight the war? I don't know these things. And, I could spend my entire life researching them, and I don't think I'd get a straight answer at all. And then if you do get a straight answer, you'll find the politicians will change their mind the next day and say, we're not selling this uranium, or we are selling it. I don't know. But the one thing I do probably have the best handle on of anybody in the market, or one of the best handles, is I see the possible supply, right? And I know it's publicly available what NexGen is going to be producing. I have my views as to when they will be producing that. And my gut's telling me, and this is not from NexGen, this is just my gut telling me, once they get permitted, and you look at the mine build, you pre-ordered all your equipment, you have a mine schedule as when you'll be in production, you can start contracting, right? As soon as you have your timelines, and I'm sure the utilities are going to go, okay, NexGen, we won't contract all our uranium from you, but we'll start contracting with you. And that's not that far away. They get their permits here in 2 years' time, and then all of a sudden start contracting 30 million pounds per annum to that's a fair amount of supply, right? So also, I'm well aware, even from the last cycle, how many undeveloped uranium projects there are around the world. Like I remember Cameco last cycle, I think they bought Kintyre, Yeelirrie, that's in Australia. There's the Ben Lomond deposit in Australia. There's a Viking deposit, one of the biggest uranium deposits in the world, is fully drilled out. That's sitting there in Sweden. Sweden just lifted the moratorium on mining uranium. Also, I remember last cycle looking at a vanadium uranium deposit in Brazil. Brazil just listed the restrictions, so you're now able to mine uranium in Brazil. So on the supply side, things have really freed up quite a bit. And the big case out there, bull case, is we need higher prices to get these guys going, and that would certainly help for some of them for sure. I don't know what the Viking one is, the break even on it, but it's also a vanadium uranium deposit, and there have been it's fully drilled out. My recollection is about 1 billion pounds in total, and so you get 1 billion pounds there, uranium already drilled out. It's a vanadium uranium deposit, and Sweden's now allowing for uranium. Well, how long would it take to get that into production? I don't know. So my sense here, and this is maybe why I'm less enthusiastic than a lot of these people, is they somehow think there's a shortage of uranium in the world, and there isn't. The other important thing last cycle that always came up was when uranium's sitting there around 140, the spot's 140. And, as you know, this is a tricky part of it, right? Most retail investors follow spot, but the real action is really with term, and it's tough to get any clarity with respect to term. But last cycle, what was interesting is there was a technology, my recollection was out of Australia, where you could extract uranium from seawater for about 200 US a pound. And that was always, in my opinion, the cap. I'm not sure if those people have continued their R&D and whether now the cost is 150, 120, 100 or whatever. But there's lots and lots of uranium around that can be put into production. That take a bit of time. Yes, it will. And then you've got also long term, if we built a bazillion reactors, last resort, you can yank it out of the seawater. So there's lots of uranium out there. So that's where I think I'm bullish on uranium. I think nuclear power is where we're at. But I just see things being long term a little bit more orderly than a lot of people expect. Everybody wants that big spike to $140 a pound to happen again. It sort of reminds me, I've been around many decades here, and it kind of reminds me of when in the early 80s, I remember when gold went over $800 an ounce, right? So for the next 30, 40 years, everybody's, I can't wait for a big spike just like those old days. And we've been waiting for a spike like that since the 80s, right? So 40 years, and it hasn't happened again, right? So will it happen here in the uranium market? I don't know. There are a lot of people expecting it. I can be proven wrong. You get a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, where $30 billion hedge fund throws like $5 billion at the spot market, and it's like jumping on a tube of toothpaste, right? You're going to get spot crazy high, and a bunch of money will be made. But we've all seen this before, and you don't buy into that, you sell into it, right?
Right. So, aside from some major event like a hedge fund entering the space, do you think it's accurate to say that the spot price does need to go higher to incentivize a lot of these miners for their input costs and their capex and everything like that to bring it out of the ground? You're just saying it's not going to be a parabolic spike like it was pre-Fukushima. Is that kind of an accurate assessment of your thoughts?
Yeah, well, if I'm not saying it's not going to be a parabolic spike, but if there is because nobody knows, if there is a parabolic spike, please sell into it, because there's lots of uranium. So long term, over a period of number of years, things will get straightened around, right? And I'll give you an example of a few things I've seen in my career that have happened like this. I remember, it wasn't that long ago, a recent example was cobalt, right? So cobalt, a bunch of US hedge funds came into the market, ramped up cobalt. Cobalt was the flavor of the day. Then it collapsed. Why did it collapse? And why was I never involved in cobalt? Why didn't I care about cobalt? I don't care about cobalt because cobalt comes from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And I know that there's no way we're going to bet our electric future on the Congo. It's a tough place to operate. I've been there. I've had investments there. It's really, really tough. And my pitch to anybody who would listen was always, don't touch cobalt. If you don't think every single battery engineer in the entire world is trying to engineer out cobalt, you'd be mistaken. Cobalt will not be in the battery metals stable going forward. And at some point, we'll crack the nut and we will not have cobalt in batteries, right? So that's exactly what's been happening. There's an article here recently in one of the big newspapers about that exact thing, that people are moving away from cobalt. So that big run up happened. And then the hedge funds looked around and said, where are the suckers to buy all this, right? And, you know, there were no suckers to buy them. And they just right back down again. So this time what's happening is you're probably aware there's a Twitter community out there that beats up on me for being just a bull, right? Just a bull. I'm only a bull. I'm not a super bull, right? I'm not. I haven't, I'm not whatever. I'm not a super bull, right? I'm not one of these crazy bulls who wants to, the term I hear occasionally is generational wealth, right? So, anyways. I'm not a super bull, but the issue we have to watch, of course, is some of these super bulls are so rabid, you kind of wonder as to who's paying their paychecks. And, I think, you should probably call out one or two of them and say, hey, by any chance, do you guys take compensation from any uranium juniors or any uranium companies to tweet all this bullish stuff that's insanely bullish on uranium? And I just ask them that, see what they say, because I'm pretty sure there's a few of them out there that are taking in dough, because you cannot spend, 12 hours a day pumping uranium without, some compensation coming in. And some of these tweets and pumps are just unbelievable. So trust me, I'm not taking dough from any juniors to pump uranium. I'm just kind of looking at it going, yeah, I've been waiting for this really strong uranium market for 7 years, and just the secondary supply just keeps coming at us, and it just hasn't stopped. And now I see 30 million pounds coming at us. It'll probably start entering the term contracts in a couple of years, and then I just watched. The Viking is an interesting one, because I know the guys who have the majority of the Viking deposit now. So they probably have. I don't know the exact number. I haven't looked into in great detail. They probably have 700 million pounds of drilled up uranium. Well, what level is that economic at? I don't know, but that's a lot of pounds of uranium. That's just one. That's not anything in Australia, not anything in Niger that's coming on stream. There's lots of uranium out there. So if there is a spike, if somebody decides to ramp uranium, don't be like a lot of the losers last cycle, which is buying these nonsense juniors, the 400 to 500 juniors out there, because they're all going to go to zero, and don't get left holding the bag. And just realize there's lots of uranium. Given time, there'll be lots of uranium in production. Nuclear power plants will have all the uranium they need. So let's not get too crazy carried away. But hey, despite that, I'm not driving the bus here. I'm not the one making the decision to throw a few $1 billion at the uranium spot market and see what you could do to have some fun.
Right. Now, do you have an opinion on what the spot price needs to go to on average for your average, let's say, developer bringing a mine into production, a NexGen, a Global Atomic, something like that, who is already starting to build their mine at this point, that they need a much cheaper price of uranium, I believe, than a lot of others. But what do you think your average miner out there needs? Because, of course, we're also seeing inflation. We're seeing issues with supply chains. Rick Rule is saying somewhere around 70, 75. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that narrative mostly I've tracked, that narrative's coming out of also Cameco, right? And when you look at, let's fast forward here in a few more years, you'll have the Kazakhs, right? They're sort of around the $10, sub $10 level, right? So we're talking, do you know how much money the Kazakhs are going to be making at $70 uranium? They'll have a margin of $60. Like, those margins are frankly unheard of. And so if we do get to 70, trust me, those Kazakhs are going to be cranking up production. And because they're in situ recovery, it doesn't take very long. I spoke with the former CEO of Kazatomprom, and he said, Warren, he says, give me $100 million, we'll have a whole bunch more uranium production online in a year's time. So they have capacity to crank up uranium, and trust me, if I was the CEO of Kazatomprom and we had any spike in uranium, I'd be cranking up the spigots and just producing as much as we could into those levels, right? Okay, so that's one example. NexGen, again, similar type economics around the $10 level. So can you imagine how much NexGen is going to be making at $70 uranium? They'll be making an absolute fortune. And those would be two of the major players. So then somebody's out there saying, well, we need $70. Like, well, two of your biggest players make tons of dough at $20 uranium. So why do we need well, the incremental supply, and it's all about the incremental pound, right? And that okay, well, the incremental pound, well, who's throwing that around? Well, Cameco is doing it because they've got two very high cost mines, right? Arguably, Cigar Lake and McArthur River are the two of the most difficult mines in the world, right? The technologies they're using to mine the uranium, they're quite impressive, but there is a cost to that, right? So let's say we did get the $70, and it wouldn't necessarily be spot. It would probably be, people could term it $70, $80 somewhere in there. Would that incentivize a lot of production? Yeah, it would. I think there's as soon as you start getting higher, the number of projects that become economic all of a sudden really increase. And so we'll see what happens if that indeed does happen. It'll happen in time. Like you'd mentioned before, every year goes by, cost of diesel fuel, cost of yellow trucks, cost of permitting, the cost of steel, cost of everything seems to gradually be going up. So there are indeed cost pressures, and we'll need higher prices for uranium to get these guys going. But at $70, I imagine a lot more will be economic than there are today. Remember, that's a 40% increase from $50. So you'd think it would swing a few of them from being uneconomic to economic. Now, the problem you have, of course, is if that move to $70 happens too quickly, well, how are they going to get financed? Like, who's going to finance uranium projects on a spike, right? So it has to be, the people financing it and backing those types of projects need to have some level of confidence that you're going to have sustained prices at those levels. Because worst thing I've seen this happen in, let's say, last cycle in iron ore, right? What they did is the major players just sat back, let the price of iron ore run up. All these juniors got financed. They're all ready to put things into production. Some of them are already starting their mine build. And then the majors who control the supply of iron ore go, well, we've had enough of this. Let's drive down the price and bankrupted everybody, right? So that is the nasty world we live in the mining sector from time to time.
Right. So I want to bring up one more point that Justin Huhn made, which was that he stated that there is plenty of uranium inventory being held, but that the vast majority of it is strategic. He was pointing to over 1 billion pounds, but saying the majority of it was held by nuclear utilities and governments, and so thus wouldn't be sold into the market at any price. So wondering what your response is there.
Well, I guess the response is, so where does the 420 million pounds come from? And he's exactly right. I'll give you an example. And this is not necessarily a bullish case. People are telling me, oh, Warren, the Japanese restarts they're gonna be buying a whole bunch of uranium. I'm going, they are? I said, well, you do know that I remember asking a senior guy at a major uranium company about the Japanese inventories and whether they're going to come back onto the market. He says, no, they're not. He says, the Japanese, a lot of their inventories are already in fuel bundles, right? So they're not going to unbundle it and then just puke it back into the market. So they're going to just hang on to that. And as you know, there was a lawsuit also with TEPCO who didn't want to take uranium from Cameco, claiming force majeure. I'm not sure where that states, but for a number of years, not only did the Japanese have all this uranium sitting around in fuel bundles that they couldn't sell, which is exactly correct, but they were take or pay contracts, right? So they had to keep buying uranium because they contracted for the uranium, despite not using the uranium. So I don't know where there's how much of that stuff they're sitting on. I don't know. Maybe that was the stuff that may have the contract that they purchased and flipped it back into the market. I'm not sure, but that's a bit of a wild card there too. But the, with respect to strategic reserves of uranium and governments holding them and blah blah blah. I've seen this in other commodities too. They're strategic until they're not strategic. The Bank of Canada in the 90s sold all our stupid gold, right, at $2.50 an ounce.
Yeah, that's true.
So, it was strategic until it wasn't strategic. And, if any of these companies, any of these countries are saying, well, we're not going to use all this uranium. Why have we got it? Let's look at the price just ran to $70. Let's puke it onto the market. So there's the other thing too, along with that, at $70 may spur on some additional production, but it also may spur some of these uranium stockpiles to kind of get people going, well, why have we got this uranium? It's $70 now. We paid $20 for it. Let's sell it. So you may get a bit of that happening. Interestingly, I got a call from a guy the other day, wanted to sell me 1 million pounds of uranium. I'm like, what, dude? It's not what I do. Okay. I know you see me on YouTube talking about uranium, but I'm not a buyer of 1 million pounds. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's somebody who'll buy it from you. Go call up Spud or something, right? Maybe they'll buy it off you. But yeah, it's an interesting market, and you're exactly right though. Like everybody's keeping their cards close to their chest. Everything's very secret. Nobody wants to talk about anything. And I come across in my travels like, oh, Warren, there's a stockpile of X millions of pounds sitting in the desert here. Why don't we go and bid ABC company that needs ABC country that needs the dough? We'll bid them for those pounds. And I occasionally see these kind of deals floating around, but there's uranium slopping around the world, and there's nothing like the one thing I remember. I was around, obviously watching the gold market when gold hit 800, but I'll tell you, when gold hit 800, everybody was going through all their kitchen drawers and they were all looking for old rings, whatever, and they were just, pulling out their gold teeth and shipping them in for $800 an ounce. And they were just, it's surprising high prices what it'll do to kind of find stockpiles of things that would otherwise not be for sale. There's strategic reasons, but wow, $70 a pound? So, we'll see, man. Like, I don't think anybody has the answer here, and as to where it's going. So we don't know.
Right. I want to give one more counterpoint to something you were talking about, and this is from a guy called Praise Capital on Twitter. He actually wrote a 25-tweet thread about your outlook on uranium. And I'm obviously not going to go through it all. It's incredibly detailed. But one of the things he pointed out was that in your target of a 2% demand increase per year, I think you mentioned that earlier in this interview and also on a recent INN interview, he said that you weren't considering reactor extensions as well as restarts. Obviously, you've covered Japan. You think that's not quite as bullish as somebody as Rick Rule believes because they're shutting other reactors down. But what about reactor extensions that are also happening in some of these countries around the world?
See, reactor extensions do not increase demand. There's the answer. Like, okay, we're going to shut this reactor down. Now we're going to extend it for another 2 years. So in other words, instead of losing that, we're going to continue it running. And that makes a ton of sense. So how is that bullish? That means that...
I guess he's saying that uranium that was previous... Right. I guess he was saying that the extension would... Because your 2% target was based on the number of nuclear reactors being built out. So if they're going to extend the life of several of these different nuclear reactors over the course of however many years, could be up to 80 years, that will bring on more incremental demand. That's how I understand it anyways.
Yeah, I know it won't. Because what he'll be doing is he'll be extending, let's say the average, like we talked about this, the average life of an American reactor is 40 years. Okay, you extend it to 60 years. Is that reactor going to use any more uranium than it was going to plan that would have used every single year? And so instead of having, remember, you got a base of 450, right? And then you got if we didn't build another reactor, it starts ticking down, right? So demand is declining. So by extending it, you're not increasing demand, you're just stopping the demand reduction, if you know what I mean. So
I did want to touch on NexGen really quickly here because, as you mentioned, you made a lot of money in NexGen, and in terms of when they're going into production, because I did an analysis video on NexGen, and I could not find any information from the company itself as to when they plan to go into production. That was one of the things. I'm an investor in NexGen. I'm bullish on the company. They've got, the greatest, if not the greatest, one of the greatest uranium deposits in the world right now. But I did not see any indication, even estimated, when they plan to go into production. I've talked to people who say it'll be 15 years before they go into production. They're not going to be anywhere near producing this cycle. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that. I know you mentioned earlier you think once they get permitted, they're gonna be able to get to production. But how do you see that playing out?
yeah, well, that narrative, there's a lot of people who I don't want to name names, but I know who's saying it. They're saying NexGen will take 10 years to permit, or they're waving their arms with these big permitting times. And, I've asked the people at NexGen, I've asked people close to the situation. I said, well, what do you think? I said, well, you never know, but, we're thinking it's realistic to assume within a few years. He says, this is a priority for not only you think about it, it should be a priority for the government of Canada. It's clean energy. Its priorities, you got First Nations on side. It's in a uranium province. It's in a province that is very familiar with uranium. And you got Brad Wall, the former premier of the province, is on the board. So you have everybody is all going in the same direction. You got First Nations on side, you got the feds on side, you got the provinces on side, you got the whole green energy thing on side. So I would be shocked if I didn't see this permitted within 2 years. And then 2 years, well, then you have to ask yourself, okay, you got permitted. So how long would it take to build the mine? And, I would imagine what they're doing right now in anticipation of getting permits, they're probably putting in as much infrastructure as they can, like roads and things like that, in advance of getting the permit to actually build the mine. So I'm not sure how much of that mine build they're front end loading. And remember, if you look into it, it's not a very big mine. It's quite a small mine because it's so rich. And that's what makes it so profitable. It's a very small mine. So can you build a small mine in 4 years? I would think so. But so on the outside, let's say 2 years permitting, 4 years, that's 6 years. But remember, all I know is if I was the CEO of NexGen and we got permitted and then we have the mine build schedule, and it says it'll be built in 3 years. And I say, well, let's give ourselves a 1 year leeway. Let's say 4 years, just to be safe, and talk to the utilities and say, listen, here's the situation. We believe, our mine builder says it'll take 3 years to build. We're going to put in a 1 year safety mechanism just in case something happens. We'll start contracting 4 years out. Maybe I'm just too naive, but it would make a lot of sense to me to start doing that. And then remember, a lot of these, that's kind of when these guys, some of these big reactors are looking for contracting, is kind of that time frame. So the next few years will be interesting, and we'll see what happens. I'm not a contracting expert, but I would think especially these big U.S. utilities are going, what, we've got a Western supply with our closest ally just north of here, and we could lock in as many pounds as we need. Sign me up.
So what are your thoughts on NexGen potentially getting acquired by a bigger player in the basin, such as Cameco? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I've had discussions with Cameco about buying NexGen on a numerous of occasions, and I remember once speaking to a senior executive, I don't want to name names, when NexGen was around 75 cents, and said, do you guys not see what we have here? Why don't you pay us $2? We'll be on our way. You'll have this massive development pipeline. It'll be great. And they just kind of looked at me as if I had three heads, right? So, okay. Then, it's not a secret. I believe Cameco needs to buy NexGen to even have a future in the uranium business. But then you notice what Cameco does here recently, which is, again, confounds the heck out of me, buying Westinghouse and going, okay, this is Cameco. You're the guys who are bullish on uranium. You have the world's biggest uranium mine being built in your in your province, not that far from you guys, but you don't buy it. Instead, you get vertically integrated and you buy Westinghouse and going, but I thought you guys were the super bullish ones on the price of uranium. Yet you've got one right there. It'll be the finest uranium mine in the world, and you won't buy it, but you'll buy Westinghouse instead. And you're moving away from producing uranium. I go on, so I cannot say that I understand what goes on within the walls of Cameco. I would have picked off NexGen way sooner when it was super cheap, and they would have been now looking at owning the world's greatest uranium mine, but they don't, and instead they have tired old MacArthur River, which has been mined since the start of this millennium here. It started around 2000, and then Cigar Lake, who knows when that runs out, probably, and I don't want to get into that, but so I think that would have been at one point a very smart strategic move for them to make, but they didn't. They decided to do something different, which we'll see how that works out for them.
Yeah. And so I know that your argument is against those people who are crazy perma bulls, who are looking too hard at the junior mining space, hoping for a repeat of the pre-Fukushima bull run. But what would you say to someone who maybe has more realistic expectations, who's investing in the Camecos, the Kazatomproms, the NexGens, and who isn't expecting a massive gain, but is taking more of a conservative approach to the sector? Do you think that's still a good play here in 2023?
Yeah, it's not a bad thing in a diversified portfolio to have some uranium exposure for sure. You want to have some copper, you want to have some nickel, you want to have some uranium, absolutely. The issue, of course, is if you want to make money investing, generally what you do is you buy when everybody hates the sector that you're in, right? Or it's a sector's on its butt and has some headwinds, and that's when you usually buy. But probably not the worst thing in the world. The issue too right now is, with everybody so bullish on uranium, it's not as if a lot of these prices are super duper cheap. And then if you're buying, if you're buying uranium companies, like, how do you feel about owning a Kazakh uranium producer? Like, how would I feel? I'm going, I personally wouldn't own it. How do I feel about owning Cameco? I personally wouldn't own Cameco. Would I own NexGen? I own NexGen. I own some NexGen. Not as much as I did before. I was 1 point over 10% of the company. And I've been gradually selling because I can't have 100% of my fund in NexGen, right? There could be some opportunities here in the uranium space with some new discoveries. But it's tricky now because I'll give you a sense as to how it's different this time versus when I got involved in NexGen. NexGen drilled a bunch of holes that, in my opinion, were amazing, but the market didn't react. And then you look at, let's say, a recent good discovery here is Fission 3.0, right? With Ray Ashley, and Dev's back at it again, right? Dev's been in the basin for quite a number of years, so they racked up a bunch of success there. And Ray Ashley, I've known Ray Ashley for 25 years, right? So, they're on Fission 3.0, and I looked at it. I was looking at possibly jumping in, and at the time, I'm going, holy mackerel, this is not like the old days when you'd make a discovery and nobody cared, and you had tons of time to do your research, get in, but now you make a discovery and, everybody's on it, right? So it's a little trickier to make money in the uranium space now because it's not the super big value. So, so I'm not a Super Bowl, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so before I let you go, I do want to hop off the subject of uranium now for a moment and just get your view on what other commodities you're watching right now. I know you gave a presentation on nickel at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference as well. So I know you're bullish there. Could you let us maybe talk a little bit about nickel and then any other commodities out there you think investors should maybe be paying attention to?
Yeah, well, nickel has a special place in my heart. The reason for it is, as I watched a number of people I work with when I was just starting in this business, I watched them make an absolute fortune on Voisey's Bay, right? And Voisey's Bay was a nickel sulfide discovery, and it was found by Robert Friedland, and that helped Robert, who is, Robert Friedland, one of the most incredible mining entrepreneurs in the world today. It refurbished Robert's reputation that he was having a hard time, obviously, in the U.S. prior to that, but he's been on a roll ever since, and it was a tremendous win for him. It was a tremendous win for everybody on Bay Street, and people made an absolute fortune. And I watched that happen. I watched, just everyday guys making $10 million. And that was back when $10 million meant something, back in the early 90s. Can you imagine what you do with $10 million back then? And it was over a $4 billion takeout. So I've always had an eye for nickel sulfide, and I've researched a bunch of them. I had Tony Naldred on retainer, who is one of the world's foremost nickel sulfide experts. In fact, he consulted to Robert on Voisey's Bay. He's since passed away, but he was a dear, dear gentleman. In fact, he taught what he knew about nickel to a whole generation of geologists throughout in the field today. And I learned as much as I could as a dumb math guy about it. But I learned a number of things. And so for many decades, I've been looking for a nickel sulfide. I had a bit of a false start with Noront. I worked with Tony on that. And it was clear to us when we looked at the genesis of Noront that there weren't going to be multiple Eagle deposits. So I backed off of that one. But since then, I've come across what I believe is one of the best nickel sulfide situations I've seen in my career. And that is, it kind of has a number of the things that I like to see. It's super cheap. Nobody knows about it. It's run by good people. It's in a good jurisdiction. It has all their permits. It has a workforce. It has power. It has water. It has everything you need. And I believe they're going to have a massive amount of nickel sulfide, and it's located in a good jurisdiction of Botswana, and it's called premium nickel. And so it's muddling along here. It's definitely not super duper expensive, and they just had a bit of a hiccup on their financing here, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of the story. I went to visit the project back in December, and I really, really like what I see, and I think we could be sitting on something really, really special here. So for any of your investors that are looking at uranium, well, look at uranium companies, see what the risk reward is there, and then take a look at premium nickel and judge for yourself what could happen here. But I believe it has a market cap right now, of a couple $100 million Canadian, which is pretty cheap. And I believe if things unfold the way I think they will, it'll be a multiple billion-dollar company within a number of years. So that's what gets me excited, and it's probably my most exciting name. Also, the news today: Teck spinning out their met coal division. We've had Teck selling their Peace River coal. We've had a number of coal assets are going to be trading hands here in northeastern British Columbia. Met coal, it seems to be a very interesting thing. And to give you an example too, like many people know that I'm involved in Colonial Coal. I'm the largest shareholder. Here's just a sort of a contrast to how hyped up and jacked up everybody is in the uranium space. Met coal is trading, depending on where you are FOB, right? It's around $380 a ton, right? Well, you could buy drilled out resources for a quarter, for 25 cents a ton in the ground in Canada, in a mining jurisdiction with rail and port infrastructure. So that's another little gem I like, and we'll see what happens then over time. It's sort of deep value investing. You have to be patient. It may happen where they might get bought out here in the next 6 months. It may take a couple more years, but it's certainly when you're buying something as cheap as that, and you know that demand for met coal is not being reduced. Nobody's looking for met coal. and you've got high quality reserves, very large in Canada, it's not a bad place to be. And then I've also got some assets in copper, and so I've got some super duper cheap copper situation, trading probably about right now $1.50 a pound. Precedent transactions on takeouts usually happen around the 4 to 6 cents a pound. So we'll see what happens there, and that's quite a bit riskier. It's Sol Gold is in Ecuador, but we've got a really good banker on the case, and he'll see what he could do about getting the company sold. So I'm hoping we'll get get a pretty good value for it in a sale, but the sale may not happen. So that's sort of one of those deep value things. So Colonial's a value, Sol Gold's a value story, premium nickel. It's super cheap. It's got tremendous growth. And then I own some NexGen, and I must admit, I own a couple junky uranium names that could rock and roll. If, so hey, $70 uranium might make a ton of money. One of the more interesting uranium names is District Metals, right? Like run by Garrett Ainsworth, former head of exploration for NexGen. I gave him some money when he left NexGen. I said, well, I'll give Garrett some money. And then he got involved in zinc. I go, are you sure you want to be in zinc? And anyways, he's in zinc and I'm backing him. And then he goes, Warren, there's this really neat uranium deposit in Sweden called the Viken. And so sure enough, he goes out and stakes it. And like a couple of weeks later, Sweden says, hey, we're going to allow for uranium mining. So he's sitting on hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of uranium in this little wee junior. So, if you don't think that I'm hoping for the big spike in uranium, it would suit me very, very well. But, we'll see what happens.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Warren. It's so great to hear a different perspective. I usually have guests who are uber bullish on uranium. So I really like to hear your take. And I think you make a very compelling argument that people should perhaps stop being a cheerleading squad just because they love the commodity. People fall in love with it, right? And then they kind of lose track of the fundamentals sometimes. So really appreciate that. For those who want to learn more about Rosseau Asset Management or hear more from you, where's the best place for them to go online?
Oh, if you want, just follow me on Twitter. And I've got a really nice new Twitter picture too. My nephews were bugging me last night. Saying, you can't be a rhinoceros the rest of your life. You got to get rid of the rhinoceros picture. Put a picture of yourself there. So that's where I've got a nice new picture. Just follow me on Twitter. We'll see what happens.
Okay, awesome. I'll put a link to that in the description below so people can go ahead and give you a follow. And thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to having you on again to continue the conversation.
And I look forward to having our VREC panel being made public for everybody to see. It'll be tons of fun to see what the reaction is.
Yes, that will actually be up by the time this interview goes live. So for anybody watching, there'll be a link to that in the description as well. Thank you so much, Warren, and you have a great day.
You too, Jesse. Thank you.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.